We got there in the end, a sprint race won by Max Verstappen with Oscar Piastri, a brilliant second. How many great drivers of the future have made their mark initially at Spa doing something dramatic? There he was, qualifying second, ahead of his teammate for sure, and also ahead of a lot of other big stars, just behind Max Verstappen. And then because Max came in on the second lap for his intermediates, because the track was drying very quickly at a wet rolling start behind the safety car, mandatory on wets, Max stayed out for one lap as he would, because he was the guy without the spray, just get a little bit of a lead and then come in for intermediates. But Oscar came in the lap before, and that was obviously the best lap on which to come in, the opening lap of the race indeed. And so he was leading. He was leading this sprint race at Spa. Very nice for him to say afterwards, I think, well, I was kind of leading a sort of race, and I think I'm in a sort of top three. This is not a Grand Prix, it's a sprint. Yeah, really, really good. Humble and totally understated in terms of what he achieved today, I think. Upstaging his teammate, for sure, Lando. And I'm a big Lando fan, don't get me wrong. And also having some big, heavy names behind him, let alone Max behind him in his mirrors at a restart. And Max passing him easily and pulling away. But Oscar still absolutely superb. And I don't know when this star was born. Was he born here this weekend at Spa? No, he's been around already, hasn't he? We saw it at Silverstone in spades, and we've seen it even before that. Qualifying was interesting meanwhile, because it was wet in SQ1, sprint Q1, and it was drying quite quickly in SQ2, but definitely not to the point where you want to go out on slicks, unless you were Lance Stroll. And they sent him out on a set of mediums. Can you believe it? I just didn't get that at all. If you're going to put slicks on when it's dodgy, wouldn't they be the soft tyres? Anyway, he's on mediums. And at the end of his first sort of skittish lap out of the pits, this is SQ2, he said the track's not ready for it. But he continued, and he was on his flying lap, and then sure enough slid off, not at the downhill right-hander, which was an obvious place he was going to go off, but the even more slippery downhill left-hander immediately after that just went straight off into the tyre wall. They could have moved the sprint forward to avoid the rain, but they didn't do that, I guess, because they have a regulation saying there must be 4.5 hours between sprint shootout and sprint race. And I guess that's to repair cars like a Lance Stroll Aston Martin if it's been put in the wall and the front right wheel has been dinged backwards. So, yeah, of course, they got his car rebuilt. And as it happened, Lance actually drove very well in the race. Just to finish the whole Lance Stroll Aston Martin thing, in doing that, Fernando Alonso didn't make it through into Q3 in the other Aston Martin. He'd been very quick in SQ1 by going out right at the end when the track was obviously at its quickest, and there weren't too many cars around at that point. He got a really good lap in. He finished SQ1 in P3. And they decided to do the same policy in SQ2, which is always playing with fire in slippery, wet conditions. If it works for you once, you might think, we won't get away with that again, because almost certainly there's going to be a yellow or a red or something. You don't leave it till the last millisecond, which is what they did with Fernando. And of course, when Stroll hit the wall, that was it. Fernando hadn't done a lap, so didn't get into Q3. And then in the race, he was way down and not a great weekend so far for Fernando Alonso, that is for sure, because he lost it at Pouhon, just leaning on it, hit a curb, an exit curb at Pouhon, quick corner, obviously, right rear on the curb, very, very slippery at Spa. I would know. I've hit one at Blanchimont and had a big shunt. They're very wet, the curbs at Spa, if you do hit them with load on them. And went off into the boonies and brought out the safety car again, kind of getting ahead of myself, because I don't want to detract from the job that Max Verstappen did today. He got the pole, but it was very, very close. He wasn't actually quickest in Sector 2 on this occasion, for a very good reason, I think, and that's because of that Lance Stroll shunt that I've just described. It's a little bit like Monaco on his qualifying pole lap at Monaco, when he wasn't brilliant in Sector 1, because that is where Sergio Perez had gone off earlier, his teammate in this occasion. And if you're Max Verstappen and you've got the best car in Formula One, apart from your teammate perhaps, and you've got a championship always to think about, and you've got an opportunity to win every race basically, and it's a qualifying lap, or it's the sprint qualifying, it's understandable if he then builds in a bit of margin. So he wasn't brilliantly quick in Sector 2 where Stroll had gone off, where it was really slippery, but he made up for it in Sector 3 and got he'd lost something like 0.6 of a second through sector 2, but he made it all up in sector 3, a little bit like the Monaco lap. And where did he do that? Well, because it was semi-wet, you couldn't say short corners here. It was all touch and finesse, but it was interesting watching him through the last chicane coming onto the pit straight, because obviously you want as straight an exit as you can possibly get there as you're just accelerating towards the timing line. And there is a moment, if you look at the onboard, there's a moment when he's got the car, he's gone into the right and then he turns left, and then he just straightens the wheel slightly, and you can just see he's got the car, he's got more lock on the car that he needs, and then he straightens it. It's exactly what I do talk about when I talk about he's in that transition zone, and then he needs to find the diagonal exit. And you can see that he did that absolutely to perfection on that last corner and got the pole by a tiny, I think it was a 0.011 over Oscar Piastri, because he'd left so much margin in sector 2. And reflecting very much the way Red Bull go racing, even if they have got the best car and the championship is looming in the way it is, they had him going over the start-finish line to begin his flying lap in Q3 with 3 seconds to spare. That's how tight it was. But as Max did that, he knew that nobody on that lap of Spa was going to have the track drier or quicker than he had it then right in front of him. Just call it great organisation. Before we go on then, let's just have a look at the maximum speeds from the shootout, which was in the dry at the end, so they're relevant. They're relevant for tomorrow as well, because the cars have been in Parc Fermé since the end of first practice, or since before qualifying yesterday, so they're not able to touch them apart from front flap adjustment. And this gives an idea of A, what happened in the sprint race in terms of what everyone was doing on the straight, and B, what we might be able to expect tomorrow, particularly if it is dry. And at the moment the forecast is for it to be dry. So you can see there the Alpines just taken off wing really quick in a straight line. Probably you could argue maybe a bit too quick in a straight line, but it served them well, and Pierre Gasly drove really well in the race, in the sprint race, to beat on the road Lewis Hamilton. Because Pierre is quick. I keep going off at tangents, but I might as well. Pierre is quick. He's very, very good in the wet too, and the semi-wet, and that really came to light in his short period of his career he spent in Japan in Super Formula, when there were a lot of wet races, and particularly he won a race in Suzuka in the wet, just blew everybody away. And that was when Red Bull really decided this guy was good. Anyway, you can see how quick the Alpines are there. And then Lewis Hamilton, also Mercedes would be thinking at this point, for the wet conditions, we would have preferred to have had more wing. But Lewis unable to do anything in a straight line about the Alpines, which shows how good they were. And then Sergio Perez 310, Ferrari 309, 308, and Max way down in 307. But look where the McLarens are. They've really got probably a little bit too much wing, you could possibly say. Although with the way Oscar's going and driving the car, it's just about right for the package they have, isn't it? I mean, they're out there upstaging the factory Mercedes team, no problem whatsoever. But 304 in a straight line, compared with even with Max at 307, that was enough in the sprint race, with Max rejoining from his pit stop behind Lando Norris in the pit lane. And they replayed that a few times to try to get, I think, commentators to say, oh, look, Lando's holding him up to allow Oscar to get the lead. I'm not sure Lando would be that protective of his man Oscar Piastri, to be honest with you. So I think that's reading a bit too much into that one. Anyway, by the time he rejoined, Max was now in P2, and then the safety car came out for the Alonso off. It wasn't really a shunt, because by the time it's so much runoff and gravel on the outside of Pouhon, by the time he actually got to the tyre wall, he'd stopped. But at the restart, Max was just on him. This is a guy with everything to lose. And I don't know, I was thinking, wow, Oscar Piastri's seriously good, and he's young. Max doesn't know the way he drives. He doesn't know him very well, probably at all. And there he was, out of Eau Rouge, right on him. And then, of course, the headwind, if you like, came into play, and Max just pulled out. Correct. Let me get it right. He's in 7th gear going through Eau Rouge, gets 8th, and then pulls out, and boom, straight past. Lovely piece of driving. Really, really good. And Oscar, to his credit, did nothing at all. Oscar Piastri, I think, to me, he's all class. And I love his approach. I love the way he's just laconic and very, very relaxed about everything. And yeah, for me, he said it all with what he was doing today out there on the track. And again, just to underline how good Oscar is in Sector 2 at Spa, which I keep saying it's very important because there's a lot of corners there and you cover a lot of ground. And if you've got the car working there, you can kind of do it for the rest of the lap, as Max Verstappen proved. So bear in mind, Max got the pole. It's quite unusual for the pole to be set by a driver who isn't quickest in any of the three sectors. But things are going Max Verstappen's way, and that's the way he did it. Really good. And he left the margin that he needed to leave because, again, it's not only I'm leading the World Championship, I need to be careful. He's got this great racing car, and he doesn't want anything to touch it. He certainly doesn't want a tyre wall to touch it or anything else to touch it, because the minute that happens, it won't feel quite the same. And I think it's this protective thing of this great racing car that Max has. And we saw that today. But he still got the pole. Brilliant. So Oscar finished second, a really good second, got to say, well clear of Pierre Gasly, who scratched for a lot of the race with Lewis Hamilton behind him. Lewis was disappointed and annoyed not to have qualified better. And a lot of that was an incident with his teammate George Russell, in which it appears George had some sort of moment coming out of turn 1, La Source, and rejoined just in front of Lewis, who was on a quick lap, or beginning a quick lap, and was in front of him going through Eau Rouge. And then Lewis pulled out and passed him, and as he went past George, he'd obviously lost time by that point. As he went past George, you could see him doing this. And I think this has to be the coolest gesture we've ever seen in Formula One. But no, perhaps not as cool as Sterling Moss just doing this in a van wall, but something akin to that, because what he didn't want to do is a really obviously rude gesture to this teammate that Toto loves. Can I put it that way? Because we know that Lewis wanted to keep Valtteri. And we don't actually know what he did, but it looked like he just pulled out alongside him. It looks like he just then very coolly just tightens his seatbelt on this side, which is like, okay, I'm getting down to it now. This is it. All bets are off. But what we don't see is what he does with his hand at that point. And I suspect he does something to George that isn't visible on the onboard. And he was really annoyed by that, I think, Lewis. But incredible diplomat. He didn't say anything about it. Somebody asked him, and he just sort of said, "Oh well." He tried to talk about it. He said, "No, forget it." And I think it says a lot about Lewis. And then in the race, he was good again. He was really good, and he would have had Pierre Gasly. Sergio Perez, who had not qualified very well, predictably, blaming massive traffic at the beginning of his lap, classic Sergio thing, and the car not feeling that brilliant in the wet, all the stuff that we know about Sergio in the wet. But he was trying hard in the race and going quite aggressively. But Lewis was all over him really in terms of positioning the car, doing what he could do, and they're fighting for whatever it was, 4th, 5th place. And at one moment, and they're two abreast, going through a couple of corners. And at one moment, Lewis is on the inside and Perez is here. And the front end of the Mercedes does that and touches the Red Bull, but they keep going. And eventually, I have to say, Perez then had to retire because something was damaged and damaged the floor, and he lost grip and he went off slightly at Stablo, and then they brought him in. But then they penalised Lewis 5 seconds for that. And that's the point of what I'm getting to say. And I just think they're racing drivers and it's wet and we know they're going to be sliding around a bit. We know there are going to be things like that. I'm not saying this because I'm pro-Lewis or anti-Sergio. Nothing to do with that. I would be saying regardless of who Lewis had been racing with or regardless of who Sergio had been racing with. I just think it's over the top in a sport which is about people making moves and if it's wet, they're going to be moving around and jinking around. To a 5-second penalty. I can't imagine how annoyed Lewis is. I mean, he really will be very annoyed, I would imagine, after that race. Because I think he feels that he's got... I mean, George, apart from that thing with George had also had a big moment at the downhill right-hander after Les Combes and gone off. And it just looked a bit messy. And everything was kind of, very nice over the radio. And everything's classic George. But he just didn't look like the George that's been giving Lewis so much trouble, certainly at the start of the year and last year. And Lewis must be feeling more confident now as a result of that. And yet, every step forward, it's sort of two backwards. That's kind of how it seems. And not a good day for Mercedes again, particularly now with McLaren, with the Mercedes power unit going so well. Carlos Sainz drove well, I thought, very well. P4, beat his teammate Charles Leclerc into 4th and 5th. This is once Lewis has been given the 5-second penalty. And Daniel Ricciardo, P10 in the AlphaTauri, made it through to Q2, unlike his teammate Yuki Tsunoda, out-qualified him for the second time. So, yeah, just really good. And Daniel drove a Daniel Ricciardo race. Difficult conditions, a lot could go wrong, brought the car home. No points for where he finished in the sprint race today. But that will have, A, that will give him a lot of confidence. And B, I think we can begin to say that this is a very different Daniel from the one we saw at Renault and at McLaren, which was a Daniel that had decided to leave the best team in Formula One because he didn't like getting beaten effectively by Max Verstappen. But although it was that, in reality, in his head, he had to say it was because the team was so biased towards Max and not to him, which I don't think was the case. A lot of people at Red Bull wanted him to stay, and a lot of people said, you're going to win a lot more Grand Prix, and you've got aspects of your talent that are actually better than Max's, so stay, Daniel. But he didn't do it, and he went, and he got a lot of money, and his driving suffered as a result, because psychologically he'd done the wrong thing with respect to his talent, his God-given talent. But I think all that now has been kind of washed away by not racing at all and sitting there watching other people race and wondering if he's going to have any career again. And now he's got this chance again. It's almost as if he's back in Formula One, reliving his first years in Formula One. And I think there's half a chance now that the Daniel that we're going to see, and it's going to be a bit of a progression, but the Daniel we're going to see is the Daniel that was at Toro Rosso and then went to Red Bull, which is great, good for him, and it's kind of all worked out. And he's got a lot of money in the bank now as well. So that's, I only say that because that's one of the reasons he left Red Bull. So it does have to be taken into account. So Daniel finished P10, really good. And Lance Stroll with that rebuilt car, P11. Fernando Alonso, is this the moment when Fernando Alonso's honeymoon with Aston Martin finally comes to an end and reality sinks in, which is that it is the Stroll-owned team. He didn't do very well in the race. He went off. He didn't look very happy man walking over the gravel while the safety car was out and back into civilization. I say civilization, it's kind of semi-civilized. Yeah, he didn't look a happy man. And I think this is a moment when Fernando, the way to handle Fernando now, if you're at Aston Martin, is to say, you're a much, much better driver than Lance. We're going to put everything into you now, Fernando. You are our future. Without you being happy in the car, this team is nothing. We're going to continue to improve, and you're going to win a Grand Prix for Aston Martin by the end of the year. That's what the inner Fernando would want to hear. He ain't going to hear that, that is for sure. And so we move on to the Grand Prix tomorrow. At the moment, yeah, it does appear that it'll be dry, but anything can happen in Spa, as we've seen so many times over the years. They delayed the start, and then they got it going, and then it didn't rain. They found that little window. They can do that these days. See you tomorrow for the Grand Prix proper. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Jetcraft and to Pitbox.